Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be back in the flesh. To be back in the flesh at UCI and actually have people present. It's been a long time since we've had these meetings, and we hope that things get better and we will have more and more of these events in person. I should just say on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday we have a 3-day international conference on the Achaemenid Empire. And of course, both of our guests have arrived from Europe, are part of that conference, and one is the organizer. So we hope to see you for those conferences days, which is right outside here. But today we're here for this Achaemenid Persian Empire volume that has just come out, which I will say a little bit more. But first, I think the person who's edited this book, Professor Robert Rollinger, along with Professor Jacobs, who is not here with us, I'm going to ask Professor Christoph Schafer, who is Professor of History at Touraj University, an expert on maritime history. We've been talking about shipping and how we can use his knowledge, which is an expert knowledge on not only shipping in the Mediterranean, but the wider area, to think about Persian Gulf and the Caspian Sea as models, and how to really dig and try to find the history of these two waters in antiquity. So he is kind enough to introduce Professor Rollinger.
Thank you so much, Professor Daryaee. Robert Rollinger is an outstanding colleague in the field of the study of antiquity in quite unusual combination of research fields that are otherwise little entangled. In ancient history, research conventionally focuses on Greeks and Romans in a more Eurocentric view. The view of great empires of the Orient is explored primarily by our colleagues and friends in Oriental studies. Robert combines both. He is a historian, but also brings his philological expertise not only in regard to Latin and Greek, but also with regard to the languages of the ancient Near East, such as Sumerian, Akkadian, Old Persian, Aramaic, Hebrew, Hittite, and Ugaritic. With its perspective of long duration, from the Assyrians to the Achaemenids, Parthians, Sassanids, and Egyptians, as well as, of course, Greeks and Romans, he has stepped across disciplinary boundaries to become one of the leading exponents of global history of the ancient world. It is thanks to his social skills that he has brought together the various disciplines and experts and edited monumental anthologies on empires from the ancient Near East to the 21st century. He has even devoted a separate volume to short-term empires. The just published companion is an outstanding approach to one of the most fascinating empires in world history. It is as comprehensive as total and focuses on one of the most fascinating empires in a universal and all-encompassing and truly regional and transdisciplinary approach. It gathers 114 contributions of leading experts in the field of originating from all over the globe, and it will be standard for the next couple of decades to come. International scholarship will be deeply indebted to the authors and editors of this intriguing volume. I can only conclude by expressing my admiration and gratitude to such an outstanding scientific contribution, written not only for scholars, but also for an interested audience in the topic. Dear Robert, thank you so much for all your engagement in realizing this groundbreaking and monumental publication.
Thank you. Thank you, Christoph. Thank you very much, Professor Schafer. So, ladies and gentlemen, what is it that is monumental in this work? Well, I think he is going to tell us, but it may have taken a decade to put together a 2-volume work, which is 110 chapters, which basically tries to cover almost every facet of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, or as he would like to say, the Tispit Achaemenid Empire. And it is over 1,700 pages. And so he has looked around the globe and picked some of the experts around the world to contribute from every aspect of it, and he'll talk about this. But before he discusses the book, I'd just like to give a short preview of Achaemenid studies. As students of Achaemenid history, when I was growing up, there was, of course, earlier works in the 19th century, such as Rawlinson's work, that is, of course, quite important for its time, but it was Cook's book, University of Chicago, in the late 40s, that really was the standard book to see, while in Russia, Dandameyev and Lukunin and others had begun to really do more modern works in the 70s and 80s. And if you read Persian, you would have read lots of Russian works that was done actually into Persian, which actually did not get exposed in the West. And then in the 1980s, the Achaemenid workshops came into being with the late Helene Sanchisi-Wirdenburg and others, where there are these seminars are still going on, or these workshops, and there are many, who really, I think, brought to life again this huge empire, this giant of an empire, the greatest empire of antiquity, into perspective and purview. And then in the 1990s, I think it was Pierre Briand who began working on the Achaemenids more systematically, and has written again a monumental text from Cyrus to Alexander, which I cannot remember how large it is, but it is close to 1,700 pages, which is really an encyclopedia. You just go and look for terms and ideas to get a sense of this empire, along with his Persica series in Paris. And with that, we really, I think, the Achaemenid studies had gone through changes. But that was the 20th century. And now, of course, we have this 2-volume that I think has brought everything up to date in a different perspective. So having said this, I'd like to ask Professor Rollinger, why did he decide to do a 1,700-page edited volume on the Achaemenid Persian Empire? How? Why? And what was the scope of his idea?
Yeah, actually, when I started to work on this, on these books, I didn't know that it will become a 2-volume set with 1,600 pages. But what I knew, or what we knew, so Bruno Jacobs and I, who were doing the plans and the layout and contemplating about the possible context of the book, that we wanted to do something new, something novel, something which was up to date on the one side, but on the other side also introducing new aspects into the discussions. As you have already been mentioning, Touraj, there have been major changes in how to approach the Achaemenid Persian Empire, especially, let's say, starting in the 1970s and 1980s. I think, in my opinion, the most crucial moment have been the Achaemenid history workshops, of course, because until the Achaemenid history workshops, it was quite usual, quite normal, quite standard in scholarship that we were focusing on the Persian Achaemenid Empire, let's say, through the Greek and Roman lens. So we had the Greek sources and the Latin sources, the Western neighbors, so to say, and that was the perspective on that empire. And that was, of course, a very problematic perspective because it was not only Hellenocentric, but it was also Eurocentric. So it was really even a colonial perspective, I would say. And the Achaemenid history workshops, they tried to overcome this view. They problematized it, and they showed that it's not only, the Achaemenid Empire is not only an empire worth to be dealt with as an opponent to the Greek world, but as a subject of its own. And that was a major step, I think. And actually, Pierre Briand's book, really an opus magnum, just grew out of this absolutely new approach. So that was somehow the basis of the discussion, let's say in the 1990s, or at the turn to the new millennium. And of course, you may ask the question: so what then can then be new about this empire? There can be there has a lot of novel research been done on two levels, I would say. The first one is that a lot of new sources are popping up again and again, or have been popping up again and again, so giving new insight into the topic from different perspectives. So it's not only anymore the Greek and Latin sources, but we have indigenous sources from various areas of the empire. What we knew for quite a long time, that there are important sources, of course, from Egypt, and important sources from Babylonia. But these sources from Egypt and Babylonia were dealt with by different disciplines, by Egyptologists on the one hand, and archaeologists on the other hand. And in these areas, let's say also until the 1980s, 1990s, they were very much focused on the earlier periods. So history of Egypt, the third and the second millennium, and Babylonia as well, the third and the second millennium. Whereas, let's say, the first millennium, so the time when the Achaemenid Persian Empire was flourishing, was regarded to be a late time, and it was somehow, seen as a period of downfall, as a period of ending the Babylonian history, ending the Egyptian history. So it was not really taken as it should have been taken, and that also changed. So there have a lot of new sources been edited, been excavated, been dealt with, put into new historical context. And then we have other sources as well, Aramaic archives from Afghanistan, we have from Idumea, the famous Ostraka, and so on. So there is a lot of new material coming on. This was one level to be integrated and to be dealt with in a more universal perspective. The other one is, of course, archaeology. And archaeology became more and more important. Of course, there is a deep history of archaeology, let's say in Asia Minor, where we know a lot, but not so much in the Middle East, actually, and not so much in Central Asia. And as you know, the Achaemenid Persian Empire was really one of the largest empires in world history, reaching from nowadays Pakistan to Bulgaria. So Central Asia plays a major role. And after the downfall of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, so there was really a flourishing era of new archaeological excavations, especially in Central Asia. So all these new material, which was very much fragmented because it was hidden in different small disciplines, each discipline dealing with this stuff from its own perspective, had to be integrated, had to be assessed from anew, and had to become part of a larger new approach, and that's what we tried.
Thank you. It's interesting. I mean, this is 110 chapters. I'm just wondering. So you have this empire that's now been, there are all these sources. So how was your thought process of actually organizing the book? I mean, this is a huge thing.
Yeah, when somebody from Blackwell Wiley addressed me and asked whether I could consider to do such a volume, I told them there have to be included two aspects which are of utmost importance, in my opinion, two aspects which have so far not been included in any volume dealing with the Achaemenid Persian history so far. One was, as I already mentioned, archaeology. And that's why, if you look in the two volumes book, you can see that we devoted quite a bunch of chapters to geographical regions and giving an up-to-date overview on the archaeological research of this specific period and the possible contribution of archaeology to this historical topic. So this is already a large part, and covering eras from Central Asia, as I mentioned, across the Middle East, towards the Balkan and towards northeastern Africa on the one hand. But there's a further aspect which I have not been talking so far. And that's one that has something to do with empire studies. And as you know, in the last years, decades, I have very much been engaged in comparative empire studies. And one thing which I realized and which fascinated myself when I was dealing with the history of empires is that actually the history of empire, of every single important empire in world history, does not end with the end of the empire. So there is a story beyond, a story after the downfall, a story when the empire does not exist anymore, but it's still there. It's there as a narrative, it's there as an imagination, it's there as a point of reference. It still has power, it's still somehow vibrant, you know, it's so it is there. And I was quite aware that we had to include this perspective, which is somehow labeled as reception history, but it's much more as reception history, because it's not only a history of the arts, of painting and literature, but it also has political power. You know, that earlier empires are used as models, either in a positive or in a negative way, but they are there. And that's why there's also a huge part of these volumes which is just dealing with this reception history, and adding a third aspect, that is the history of modern research. You know, how, let's say, did modern scholars from within different cultural and political contexts in the last 150 years deal with this empire, and why? What was their approach? What was it like? You know, what did they think about the empire? How did they deal with it? So there are all major countries where major scholars have been originating, dealing with this fascinating empire, where chapters are devoted to them and put them into a larger context. So from this perspective, this history of this overview of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, it is true, it starts in the first millennium BC, but it somehow continues until the present.
Thank you. I think, I mean, I have gone through the chapters, not all of them, as your interest peaks, of course, through them. I think you covered everything that one can imagine. I mean, from gender studies to study of women, to regional studies, you know, Judea and, you know, Egypt, and so on. Having done this, do you think, I mean, this seems like, you know, 5 or 10 Achaemenid workshops put into one.
Yeah.
Do you think, should we think about writing a new history of the Achaemenid Empire as a single volume? This is just a sort of hypothesis.
No, I think
having now this at our hand.
Yeah. That's, I think I can, I have to agree, because of course it puts a lot of new material, or in a very comprehensive way, into the hands of every scholar, and I think this should exactly be the way as it will work, that it will become, let's say, a kind of basis for any future form of contemplating about this empire and dealing with it. I think this is a very important point. But another one is that historical research is always a very vibrant issue. You know, sometimes people think, okay, this old stuff, we already know everything. You know, why are they going to deal again and again with these same topics? You know, this old stuff is completely different as compared to modern history, where we always have news and we always have new material to be done. But this is absolutely wrong. You know, so we have a lot of new sources, as I already tried to explain, and of course, every history we are doing is somehow dependent upon the perspective we have. We are all somehow children of our own specific time, and even if we are reflecting this, and a good historian should reflect this, even if we are reflecting this, it is nearly impossible to get out of this. This means, let's say, if in 20 years or in 10 years even a new approach is done on this empire, it will be somehow different, you know, and this is a legitimate approach, so that we also focus on historical issues from a specific angle, and that we are reflecting this. I think this is absolutely important. But your question is also related to another issue, and I think This is also important. You know, our historical disciplines, as we have them, let's say ancient history dealing with Roman and Greek sources, Egyptology dealing with Egyptian stuff, Archaeology dealing with Babylonia and Assyria, and so on, are artificial frameworks which help us to approach historical topics. And these artificial frameworks have been created in the 19th century, you know. And what was important in that very time created this artificial framework. And that means that we have historical disciplines dealing with the Greeks and dealing with the Romans. We have historical disciplines dealing with the Chinese Empire. We have historical disciplines, the Iranian studies dealing with the Iranian world. But we do not have a historical discipline dealing with the Achaemenid Empire, because it was just not, you know, up to date to devote a whole discipline to that empire. That means that the empire itself, from the way of how we approach it, is somehow separated, divided into different disciplines. So the Egyptian scholars, they are only interested into the Egyptian satrapy, and the Babylonians are only interested into Babylonia, and the ancient historians have a major focus on Asia Minor, and now Central Asian historians, they are focusing on Central Asia. But this is not a way you can really deal with this empire, because you have to overcome these boundaries and you have to take it as a whole. And I think this volume is really, we really tried, you know, to bring scholars from all these different disciplines together, and to create a uniform approach which takes into consideration all these new kind of knowledges, all these new kind of sources we have. Also integrating it, if you want to label it like this, into a new form of discipline, that is Achaemenid studies, which has also its origins with the Achaemenid History Workshop, of course, and Pierre Briand is a major figure in this kind of approach, but I think this is also important. And no scholar is really able to do this by himself or by herself, but this has to be done in a teamwork. You know?
So teamwork is the thing. I mean, it's interesting. I was looking at the names and the authors, of course, and the approaches. You said you have tried to stay away from the Eurocentrism that was dominating Achaemenid studies. I mean, I think when I sort of came into being, usually outside of ancient Iranian studies, Achaemenids are usually dealt with only vis-a-vis the Greco-Persian Wars.
Yes.
I mean, people will know about the Persian Empire in general. I'm not saying that's the rule. It's only when the Greco-Persian Wars are involved, and of course, it has its own paradigm. How have you dealt with it in this?
That's an important question, as you know, and I have always seen a problem with this kind of approach. That minimizing the Achaemenid Persian Empire on this borderland conflict, in the Aegean, and if you have a look at the empire as a whole, it has to be different. And some scholars will be very disappointed, but I'm actually very proud of the fact that if you look in these 1,700 pages, watching out for the Persian Wars, there are probably 5 to 10 pages maximum which are devoted to that conflict, and that is a plus, in my opinion, because it gives this empire a new weight, a new dimension of focusing on it, and it leaves aside this somehow old-fashioned approach of minimizing the empire into this Hellenocentric and Eurocentric perspective.
Thank you. I'll just ask one or two more ideas that I have in mind.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Of course, you're interested in empires, and I think it's a great sort of, thing to actually study the past.
Yeah.
It makes sense because it gives you some perspective. Now, what has been usually the case for Achaemenid studies is they focus on the earlier part of the Achaemenid Empire, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's Cyrus, and it's Darius, and usually by Xerxes' time you are at the end of interest in the Achaemenid history.
Yeah.
The other half is really not seen. And even when there is that interest, obviously Darius is larger than life and sort of Cyrus the Great. but it's imperial history in the matter of studying the king.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, this volume shows that there's much more. And how have you dealt with this
Yeah.
sort of part of social history,
Yeah.
gender history,
Yeah.
and so on that needs to be addressed?
Of course, the fact you have just been mentioning that, let's say, the main focus on the empire has always been on the earlier periods, ending with Xerxes or ending with the first half of the reign of Xerxes even, has again something to do with our Greek and classical sources. Because the major source, of course, is the histories of Herodotus, which are dealing with the Persian Empire and which actually ends 479, 478, and then that's exactly after the time of the confrontation between the multinational Persian army with many Greeks in this army against a coalition of Greek city-states. So and it ended with the beginning of Xerxes, and that's why this narrow perspective gained momentum, and that this is a problem I think has been highlighted. But there is a further aspect, and which takes me further to your question. Of course, also the Achaemenid Persian Empire is embedded into a larger historical context. It does not come out of nothing, it does not originate from nowhere, but it has a specific place, a specific genesis, which has to be researched and understood and explained. And this is the history of the Middle East, or you may say the history of the ancient Near East, when at the beginning of the first millennium BC with the Neo-Assyrian Empire, really imperial history starts in world history. Because why do I highlight this point? Because with this, after this time, empires are a natural moment in history, so they do not disappear anymore. Empires are and will be the dominating forces. So this process was inaugurated with the Neo-Assyrian Empire and then the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and the next one is the Persian Achaemenid Empire. And one aspect which has to be recognized in this context, and which modern scholarship in the last 20 years is very well taking into account, is the aspect that we have to distinguish between two dynasties. If we deal with the Persian Achaemenid Empire, they may be related somehow, but they are nevertheless distinct, as the history of the empire within the framework of these two dynasties is distinct. So the first one is the dynasty which we call the Taspits, of course, with especially the two major and outstanding figures with Cyrus the Great and Cambyses. And then are the Achaemenids, which are generally introduced with the Darius I, and where in many ways the empire becomes something novel and moves into a new setting, into a new dimension. So there is quite a difference, and separated by a kind of civil war, a huge war, which brought the whole empire in danger to collapse, but actually it didn't. So I think this larger imperial history embedded into the ancient East is a very important point. And the other one, of course, is what we call Iranian history, that has to be included and has to be taken into consideration, whereas this, what we call Iranian, is also a multi-layered and in these earlier periods sometimes very difficult to grasp aspect, because, as you know, it is especially Elamite history which is very important, where we can see that the Taspits are growing out of these Elamite context at the borderlands of the former Babylonian Empire, and then conquering this empire and creating something new with two major branches of tradition. The one is the ancient Eastern one, and the other one is this Elamite and Iranian one, which are put together and created something completely new. So this is, I think, a very, very important aspect where you can see two major forces. The one force is the force of tradition, which has to be taken into consideration, because otherwise we do not understand it. But on the other hand, there is always something new. This Iranian element, also this element of Elamite history, which counts and which gives way to a total new dimension of ancient Eastern history. And this we can grasp on many aspects. One aspect which everybody can see immediately is this gigantic space which has been conquered by this empire, but not only conquered, also managed for 200 years, successfully managed an empire which reached from India to the Eastern Mediterranean, successfully managed and successfully administered in different ways. So it's really, if you realize this, you see this is really an outstanding historical study and an outstanding empire, which also opened the way to new traditions and new ways of historical thinking.
Thank you very much. I would like to have the audience ask questions. It's interesting that Robert is sort of rethinking sources, especially mentioning Herodotus and sort of this Greek really focused or biased sources. It's someone who has actually really worked on Herodotus as he started, so he's an expert in the text itself and is actually discussing it, as well as actually teaching Assyriology. So he's well based in both the ancient Near Eastern and the Greek sources. And with that in mind, he's looking at it as an empire. So I think that's really interesting for me, because usually that would not have been the cases. Someone who starts with classics and the Greek sources, you stay with them. And so it's interesting that you've sort of moved around and have maybe a larger perspective of that. I'd like to open, at least for the next 10-15 minutes, if you have any questions from Professor Rollinger, and we can last session, please.
A bit general, because I noticed we start an empire and we finish it. We put the date. This is the beginning of Achaemenid. It finished Alexander the Great. Then we go to Seleucid. Then Persian came that date and Sasanian came that date, as if it finished. It doesn't, in my opinion, it doesn't finish. It goes, especially from my study, from Persian to Sasanian, you can see the trace in the government. For many centuries, then we fade out. Then Sasanian, same thing. Then Islam comes. You can see so many influence of the Sasanian in Islam. Even in my time, from Shah regime to Khomeini, nothing changed. The name changed. The government were like this till it became corrupt. Why don't we, you, not me, why don't you make a book about in between the dynasties?
No, I think this is a very important and very sophisticated question you are posing, and there is much in it. Of course, if you look at our historical disciplines, we have a problem, which is somehow a problem. On the other side, it cannot be done differently. This is the problem of specialization. Every scholar is somehow specializing into a specific topic. So let's take the Iranian history. You have those who are specialists in Arsakid history, you have those who are specialized in Sasanian history, and then you have those who are specialized in Seleucids, and those who are specialized in Achaemenid studies, and so on, And of course, scholars who are specialized into different topics, they get a special relationship to their topic. And this is, on the one hand, it can be, very, very fruitful because they have a detailed knowledge about the specific sources. But at the same time, there is the problem that you get blinkers, and you do not see anything around and larger development. So I think that's why both aspects are of utmost importance. Both. The one that a good historian has always have a direct connection to the sources. He has to know, or he and she, they have to know the source languages and they have to know what they are talking about, and that's why this kind of education is very important in our universities. But at the very same time, you have to open your eyes and to see that your discipline, what you are focusing on, is just a part of a larger world. And understanding your specific discipline and understanding the historical issues you are dealing with is much better done when you enlarge your framework. And this enlarging is sometimes not possible if you just do it by yourself, but you need to do it within cooperation. You need to have colleagues who have major expertise in that field and major expertise in that field. You have to have discussions. Actually, that's exactly what we are doing with the Bayrawi conferences here in Irvine.
Tomorrow?
Yes, tomorrow on the
Monday.
Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday on the Arsakids, and what we have been doing on the Seleucids, and what we have been doing on the Achaemenids, that we try to bring together scholars from different fields. If you may say, to force them to talk to each other, to exchange opinions, and then to create novel insight and novel approaches. And coming back to your questions, I always thought, since I'm very much interested in this kind of historical tradition, how ways of thinking, how narratives are moving through the ages, I always thought it problematic that, let's say, scholars who are dealing with the Arsakid empires, or scholars who are dealing with the Sasanian Empire, they are not really, or they are not really fully embracing, the historical depth which we are having in front of us, and there could be, in my opinion, there is a huge area of future research where this kind of tradition building and this kind of being rooted into larger historical context, the context can be used in a fruitful way, and also, and that's an important point you have been mentioning, although overcoming this artificial divide, Islamic and pre-Islamic, this is really a major, like an iron curtain sometimes, scholars are dealing only with the pre-Islamic periods, and scholars are only dealing with the Islamic periods, as if there is no communication in between, but of course there is, and there could be done a lot, Of course, ideas are somehow transformed always, they take different shapes and they change. But there is nevertheless this kind of ongoing stream of tradition and discussion which just has to be explored, And I think this is an important point.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Professor Rollinger, thank you. So my question is this: what is about the Greeks' understanding of the Persian that is really misled, that is really, biased towards Iranians, as a person who's, a layman in history, but it always has to then.
No, this is very easily explained. You have a neighbor, from outside, who is just watching from an outside perspective what is going on, and who does not really have a deep understanding of the traditions which are working within the empire, about the ideology of the administration, about the ideology of the court, about the ideology of the great king, what is important and what is unimportant to them, and everything is interpreted from this foreign perspective, And this interpretation is not presented as an interpretation, but it is interpreted, or it is presented as a historical fact. And the real problem is that this kind of view, this kind of view from the outside, has, due to historical developments, become the basic of European perspectives, so that European nations regarded themselves as heirs of the Greek and Roman world, and then they just took these perspectives and made them their own perspectives. And this took place mainly in a time, let's say in the 18th and 19th century, when imperialism and colonialism took place, when Europe was really somehow, from a political level, the center of the world. So when these perspectives were shared by a majority of scholars, and if a majority shares a specific ideology, it is generally not really recognized that what you are dealing with is based on an ideology, but you take it as a fact, you know. So, and this is really a major problem. So that the empire has not really been taken as a subject of itself, but as an object seen from outside and worth to be dealt with only under a specific circumstances. And these circumstances have mainly been the so-called Greco-Persian Wars, how the Greek heroes, you know, overcame this empire, and nothing else. So the empire was reduced to this confrontation, and it is interesting to note, just to give you an idea about how deep this misunderstanding can be, that, you know, we do not have a single source from the Achaemenid Empire which is really dealing with this confrontation. So that also is somehow telling, because for the Persian Empire this was not important at all, you know. And even concerning the details of this confrontation, everything we believe to know, you see, I'm very cautious. Everything we believe to know, we know from this one single party. And it's even more problematic, because you have to think that Herodotus wrote his histories, let's say, in the 420s. And the major events took place 490, 480, you know, so this is 60, 70 years before, you know, and this is quite a large period of time. And now there are so many problems. If you start to realize these kind of problems, then it's really eye-opening.
Sir, please.
I have two questions. What do we know about the religion of this period?
Yeah.
And what do we know about Zarathustra himself? And then I have another question.
Yeah. This is a very much debated problem still, and you can see, and this is a point I have to mention, which you can also see in these two volumes, that, of course, on many historical problems, scholarship nowadays is divided. So there is no really a common view, but there is still discussion and different opinions. And the question of religion is one of the most difficult ones, I have to say, where you also have different approaches. And there is one point, for example, so when Zarathustra lived, we do not exactly know. There are different opinions, you know. There is a late dating and an early dating. You can put him in the late second millennium, or some much later in the first half of the first millennium. And then this is the one question. The other one is, you know, how the whole tradition of the Avesta is really somehow based in its different parts into the depth of history, whether the Achaemenid Persian kings have a special relationship to Zoroastrianism, or whether they do not have one. So scholarship is absolutely divided, and you can, if you read the various chapters in this volume, you can see the different opinions about this. And I think there is one important point. We cannot really decide it on the basis of the sources we have. But I think that this is important, that we are openly telling that we cannot decide it, and that we adduce our arguments why we take this opinion or why we are taking that, and that we do not really make believe the audience that we know how it is, you know, so that we also have chosen an historical approach that is somehow problematizing historical issues. And this is absolutely true for the religious issues. Of course, you have on the one hand, you have the official royal inscriptions of the Achaemenid Persian kings, especially from the time of the Achaemenids, that is starting with Darius, where Ahura Mazda plays a major role, you know. But what does this mean? Is this an indication that there is something Zoroastrian in it, or is it just a a god that is also used somehow by the Achaemenid Persian kings. So this is a very difficult issue to deal with. Then we have this important source material from Persepolis, mainly written in Elamite, so the Persepolis fortification tablets and the Persepolis treasury tablets, where we see that especially Elamite gods play an important role, so that it's quite a larger world. And then we also have different perspectives on religious behaviors in regional sources. Let's say if we look on the Babylonian sources within the period of the Achaemenid dominance, then we see we have the classical traditional Babylonian pantheon and the Babylonian gods who are still there, and the same is true in Egypt. So you see there is not only one, let's say, one framework within which concerning religion we have to deal with the empire, but it's a plurality. It depends upon the region. It depends upon the specific historical traditions within these regions, and then you have the very specific question: what about the king, the court, the family? And actually, this is very difficult to decide. I would say, in my opinion, I can only tell you my personal opinion. I think it's a good solution to call this religious framework of which is practiced by the kings and which is visible by the royal inscription as Mazdian. So you see that Ahura Mazda plays a major role, but at the same time you are highlighting that it's not the same as Zoroastrianism. So it's much more dynamic and very difficult to deal with. But it's one of the most debated issues, and of course it's a fascinating one.
Okay, we have about 9 minutes. Can I go to one person and then we'll come back to second
Just
question?
a quick,
Please.
first of all, what a wonderful talk. And you mentioned that it was really fascinating to you that after these empires fall, the effect is still there. That is a fascinating point. But what was really the aspect that fascinated you the most about in this research, in this novel resources?
I have to say, I would first make a general comment. I think nearly anything in history is fascinating.
Yes.
I say this very consciously because I think I always thought it problematic if the one says this is the most fascinating one and the next one says this is fascinating, the most fascinating issue. The more you start to study in detail historical questions, and the more you get familiar with the specific historical framework, the more you are somehow driven into the topic, and I do not want to say that you live in this historical framework, but it becomes fascinating. Concerning the, and I said, we are all children of our times, and of course we are living in a globalized world. We are living in a world of connectivity, of entanglement, in a world not of isolation, but in a world where everything is somehow interconnected. And for me, this was one of the most fascinating aspects, to see that this kind of globalization does not start with our very modern times, but you have already many aspects of globalization in antiquity, and that this is really a historical research question which is worth to be dealt with, although in the future in more detail. And of course, the Achaemenid Persian Empire is a global player.
Mm-hmm.
It is an empire which was holding territories in the 3 continents of Asia, Africa, and Europe, and it was dominating a space which was gigantic. But, and this is even more important, an empire whose influence, whose stimulation, whose ability of triggering developments and further historical dynamics does not end at the borderlines, but which goes far beyond. You just have to think about the economic potential of that empire, of the elites in that empire that were consuming products of luxury and exotic stuff that has to be transported from everywhere, but not only from the different satrapies within the empire, but also beyond. So there was a gigantic effect of economic change, of social change, of creating identities beyond the empire. And this effect was multi-layered. It was not only one of influence, in the sense that elements of the empire were somehow transformed to the outside, but it could also have triggered the opposite, that people from the outside thought we want to make it completely different than it has been done in this empire, and people became somehow conscious that we also have a regional identity as opposed to the empire, like the Greek identity, for example. But this is a development that would not have happened if the empire wouldn't have been there, you know? So I think this is also very, 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 very important. And a question, I think, which is, you know, when we start to think about when does Greek philosophy come into being, and we take it as something Hellenic, as something European, but where does it come into being? It comes into being in the 6th century BC in Western Asia Minor, and this Western Asia Minor was at that very time part of the empire. But nevertheless, scholarship takes it as Greek, you know, because it's so much focused on nation and on language, you know. But this was part of the empire, you know. So you see, there are a lot of new perspectives which are involved, and this aspect of globalization, of really larger context beyond this national focus. I think this is one of the most fascinating one, and it's, you know, actually this is not this. You can take it as an Iranian empire in the sense that Iran was a core country of that empire, but actually it's not. It's much more than an Iranian empire. It's a multi-ethnic, multi-dimensional, multi-regional empire with a lot of languages, a lot of identities.
Cultures.
So, and also, you know, and a communication structure which was incredible, you know, transforming news, transporting letters across the empire. So it was really an imperial machinery which was astonishing, a bureaucracy that worked at the same way and level in Egypt as it worked in the provinces of Central Asia, communicating in a completely new way, and that's really. That's absolutely fascinating, you know. So and it's not really dealt with this as it should have been dealt by modern scholarship, because it's so much cut into different disciplines. And I very much hope that these two books help to change this perspective on the empire as a whole.
Thank you. One more thought, and then.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
When we think about the Greeks, Alexander and Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and Euclid and Pythagoras, so then we go across to the Achaemenid Empire. Are there any evidence of science and philosophy that remains that you can point to?
The first one is that Alexander was not a Greek but a Macedonian. And I think this is also very important, because for the Greeks, when we talk about the Greeks, we generally think about the Athenians, you know. So we know that in Greece there were more than 1,000 poleis, so it was very much diversified. And we also take Athens and what is going on in Athens as representative for the Greek spirit and for the world, and actually it was much more diversified. And I also have to add one point, you know. We always take the so-called Greek wars as a confrontation between the Persians and the Greeks. This is nonsense, you know. There were within. So this was a multinational army, and there were many Greeks taking part on the side of the great king in this army, and you know, and the same is true in the army of Alexander the Great. You know, there were Greek mercenaries fighting on the side of the great great king at the Battle of Issos, you know. Alexander was very angry about that, but there were many Greeks who hoped that this guy from Macedon would not win this battle, who were on the side of the great king. So you see already there, if you have a close look, it changes. Concerning this issue of science, you know, I already tried to hint a little bit that when we take, let's say, the Ionian philosophers of the 6th century, not as Greek, but as originating from an empire, then it's as Greek as it is Achaemenid, and it also changes somehow our perspective. But on the other hand, you know that I would say generally the ancient Near East has a lot to contribute to what we in our modern world call or label as science, and this is not only true for the Persians, but it's also true for the Egyptians and for the Babylonians. Just think about the developments of astronomy. Just think about mathematical rules and issues like that. So I think also, but this is also something future scholarship has to doing a lot of research and putting it into a larger framework that overcomes these national boundaries and that always plays, you know, with elements. And this is typical Greek because it's a Greek spirit and it's a Greek nation and more on a structural way, that specific mode of thinkings have nothing to do with blood, or I don't know, with this kind of national approach, but much more with structure and tradition beyond ethnic identities.
5 chapters of this book: schools, erudition and wisdom, astronomy and astrology, Persian enlightenment, physicians and medicine, techniques of art and architecture. Also. Last question, please.
So I think first of all, should join everyone else and say thank you. This is beyond exciting, and obviously this is a momentous work. So
thank you.
Just thank you. Yeah, thank you. I guess what got me interested in hearing you speak was about this sort of question of new narratives we can tell about the empire. It's thinking about previous scholarship, thinking about Briand in particular. It
yes.
feels like these sort of major narratives of organizing Achaemenid history is honestly political history, sometimes in the strict sense. It's just who's the king, what's he doing?
Yeah, exactly.
I was curious, in your work, what new narratives do you think are possible to tell about the Achaemenid Empire, and particularly those that involve non-imperial subjects, people who aren't the kings, aren't the satraps? Are those possible, or are they still kind of shrouded?
No, I think a narrative is always important, but because also, scholars are telling stories,
Yeah.
and also scholars want to fascinate and attract a larger audience. I think it is two things are important. That this kind of narrative has always a basis on sources, and that you as a reader are able to check, what is a fact and what is opinion, and that a good scholar also makes this kind of difference. What is fact and what is now my interpretation? I think this is absolutely important. Many times, of course, this is ignored, and highly and ideologies are presented as facts. And as I already said, if a majority of scholars shares the same ideology, they even do not realize, that it is. So that's one part. The other one is, of course, that there are different narratives, or there is a plurality of narratives, and this has also something to do with this largeness of this empire. Of course, you can focus it, let's say, from the perspective of the court and the perspective of the high administration, the perspective of the king, where you are taking into consideration the empire as a whole. But then I think, and this is also worth to be dealt with, then you have regional perspective. You mentioned the satrapies, of course, and each of these satrapies has a different histories. Some satrapies are perfectly integrated into the larger framework of the empire. With other ones, it's sometimes more based on confrontation. If you, for example, if you think about this specific case of Egypt, that it was very difficult actually for the Achaemenid Persian king to hold a sway of these very important countries, and there were again and again local satraps or local rulers tried to get rid of the empire. So there is also a local perspective, and you have a trans-regional one, a larger one, and to combine these different perspectives into a total story is a challenge, of course, but that's exactly what we tried with these 2 volumes.
So I'm excited to read them then.
Yes.
Agnik, one more. Agnik has a question.
Yes. I will not repeat the thanks part because everyone has thanked you. And I'm equally thankful for this lecture that you have given. I have 2 questions which are very short. The first thing, you mentioned 19th century and the importance of archaeology in the process of reconstructing the Achaemenid Empire. So I'd like to know that how the 19th century political situations, current political situations of the 19th century, really affected the archaeological excavations and the study of the empire, and how the political narratives were really influential in reconstructing the Achaemenid Empire.
Yeah.
And the second thing is, when we talk about the Achaemenid Persian Empire, we talk about the connections with the Egyptians, with the Babylonians, but not much is said about its connection with South Asian empires, mostly the Mauryan Empire. We have a hunch that the Mauryan columns, especially under the Ashokan regime, were inspired by the Achaemenians, mostly at Persepolis, but there are no conclusive evidence. So, what kind of global transnational connections were there between the Achaemenians and the Mauryans?
Yeah. May I start with the second one?
Absolutely.
I think this is also a fascinating topic, and as you know, also in nowadays India, historical research is very much also influenced by national perspectives, and it is not so common and not so popular to explain historical issues and also aspects of the material culture you have as being somehow triggered, influenced from outside. So this is, but of course, this is a very understandable counter-reaction within a country that has for a very long time dominated by forces from outside, and which now tries to get its own perspective on history. But as a historian, I would say the first approach, the imperialistic, is as unhistorical and as problematic as the nationalistic is right now. And the columns you have been mentioning, you know. So if I look at them, for me this is absolutely clear. There has to be a connection, you know, and a connection that is very interesting, but because they are not absolutely the same, as you can see in the Achaemenid palaces. So it's not only that that you can explain it in the way that they just picked up something from the Achaemenid palaces and then integrated. No, there was this kind of stimulation which I was just mentioning, which goes, in my opinion, that's my opinion, you know, which goes beyond just copying, but they took something and made it of something of their own. I think this is a very important aspect, but nevertheless, in my opinion, you cannot explain it without taking into consideration the empire. And you know, of course, with the Maurya Empire, we have for the first time in India really an empire. So with the Nanda, before it was very, very legendary, very problematic. So with the and not only, you know, you have elements of the material culture which are interesting, but also that rulers like Ashoka, you know, used 3 different languages for their inscriptions, for his inscriptions, you know, like the Achaemenid kings used 3 languages for their public announcements. And then, you know, and just think about when does really writing has been introduced into India, you know. You can see that the early forms, the earliest attestations we have are from nowadays Sri Lanka. So we're around, let's say, the 350, 340. So that's the element. So I think this is important because we are still close to the empire that still existed. And then think about this developed bureaucratic system which we have in the empire, especially Aramaic as lingua franca. And it is absolutely clear and also acknowledged by scholarship that the early Indian writing systems have something, I try to formulate it very neutral, have something to do, with this empire. And in my opinion, this goes even further. I think I was mentioning that an empire is triggering developments at its borderlands, And you may even go as far and ask, why does exactly at that time an imperial structure come into being in India, at the very borderlands of this former Achaemenid Persian Empire? And that has also something to do with the empire, in my opinion, that is stimulating, triggering, boosting local dynamics on many levels, on the levels of political thinking, on the level of identity shaping. And identity shaping plays an important role. You can see this, when Buddhism becomes an important element of royal self-presentation, as with the example of Ashoka. This is something completely different as in the Achaemenid Empire, but it's a part of identity shaping which just takes place at that very time, and that is not by chance. So I hope I have somehow answered your question. And the first one, of course, as I said, so the 19th century is the time of colonialism, the time of imperialism, where the world was somehow conceptualized and seen from the perspective of Europeans, and also ruled by Europeans who thought they are the apogee of world history, and everything else has to be ruled by Europeans. And all these, if you take British intellectuals, for example, or French intellectuals, French officers, or German ones, all of them were taught in Greek and Latin language. They had a deep bearing into classical education, and this classical education showed them, in their eyes perfectly, there was a world of us, that's the Greek and the Romans, and we are the heirs of them, and of outsiders who are minor cultures, not really on the same level, dominated by Western forces. So you can see that there is a similarity on the basis of ideology, which perfectly fitted into this 19th century perspective. And this is something, of course, which has changed in the last 30, 40 years, and which also changes our perspectives. And that's also a fascinating development going on.
Yes.
Yes, sir, please.
Es freut mich persönlich, Sie zu sehen.
Dankeschön.
But let me ask my question in English. I'm a musicologist, and I research about ancient music. Especially this time is a very important time in that area we're talking about. Unfortunately, I missed a lot of discussions here, so I hope I don't repeat anything.
No.
So my main question is, when I study this period of time of history, the big question is that when I search for Achaemenid imprint in culture in different areas in this area, in this region, I don't find that much. And when I search for answer why there's such a big empire for so long time, you cannot see much culture material related to the dominant political system in this region. Many people answer me this question that, Persians, we are so nice, we don't suppress anybody, we just leave them to do whatever they like to. We just maybe celebrate Nowruz or something like that, and we help them to just do their own way. We don't suppress anybody for the religion or ceremonies, cultural events, rituals, all those things. We are just there to get money and taxes, taxes and so on, and have political power over them. For example, in Egypt or in whole Anatolia and other regions outside like a traditional area of Iran. And for me, the question, it's not reasonable to me so much. And many people say, okay, Alexander came to Iran and ruined everything. That's why we don't find anything else. That's everything just gone after Alexander. But that's not possible, you know?
It's also not true.
What's that?
It's also not true.
Yeah, it's not true.
Yeah, it's also not
I
true.
mean, it's not possible. You can ruin Persepolis or main cities or a central part
Yes.
of the power,
Yeah.
but you cannot ruin everything, even if you want
Yeah.
to.
Yeah, actually, there is a lot, you know, as I already mentioned at the beginning of this talk, and there are plenty of chapters dealing with this ongoing tradition, but it also has something to do about how we look at the material culture.
Have you noticed the same
Yeah, I
thing
just
about-
give you an example, you know. So
Yeah.
you know, when you are traveling through Iran and looking for antiquity, one of the most fascinating aspects are the Sasanian reliefs, you know. And if you look where they are, you know, then you see that there is a relationship between the Iranian reliefs and the Achaemenid Persian reliefs, especially if you go at Naqsh-e-Rustam, and then you see that you know, there was an awareness that there was an older culture, you know, and that this was an important place, you know. And then if you think about, you know, let's make the next step, you know, when the Qajars in the 19th century start to create rock reliefs again. So also in the kind of consciousness that there is a deep history, a deep-rooted history of expressing political power, of expressing political dominance in that specific ways that you can trace back onto the Achaemenid empires, and there are many other issues which you can put on the same level, and which is fascinating. We have just been talking about the possible Maurya influence, and you know there are serious discussions, for example, that the Acropolis in Athens and you know and other buildings in Athens were inspired by the monumental buildings in the huge residences. So there is a much larger issue, but we have to be able to see it, because things are not just copied; they are transformed. And stimulated, so to say, and we are only able to recognize this, and now I'm repeating what I've already been told, when we open our perspective, you know, when we get rid of our national lenses, and when we see a much more multidimensional, multinational issue at play, and that's exactly what we are dealing with, you know.
So that means Persians put the imprint on the culture where they
It's
were
not.
existing.
It's not only Persia, you know. It's Iran. What we call nowadays Iran is a core element, and of course, the court and the royal family, you know, and the elites, especially the high elites. They were mainly Persian, but it was much more, you know. This is really, and that's also a problem, you know. We are now in most parts of the world, we have national states. That are following an idea that was introduced in the 18th century and boosted in the 19th century. One nation, one language, one culture, one idea, you know. But this is an empire. Empire works completely different. This is beyond this national issue, you know. It's a multilingual, multicultural. You have put an important point, that this is not so much, you know, that the so-called Persian tolerance is a problem because it's an imperial issue, you know. Empires are just dealing with political and religious issue in a much more open-minded way, and that's exactly what we are facing.
Well, I don't see the same thing with the Roman Empire.
The same thing on what level?
I mean, in the same level that you see, when you see in Egypt, Iranians or Persians, they have been in Egypt for about 100 years from campuses, and you should see many things over there that say, hey, this is Persian, but this is just applied in Egypt. But in terms of Farsi as a language, in terms of cultural events, you don't see the potteries in the style of Persia in Egypt. You don't see traditions of Persia in Egypt. You don't see many other things. You don't see them there.
Yeah.
But if you see the Roman Empire, it's just widespread. You see them everywhere. They are there. The language, the culture, the ceremonies.
I think there is something true in what you are saying, but nevertheless, also if you look at the Roman Empire, you can see this multilingual and multicultural aspect as well. On the one hand, you are right, you have specific forms of buildings which were introduced to different places in the empire, like the amphitheater or like circuses or things like that. But on the other hand, you have a bunch of local developments and also a bunch of different languages that have been used. So two major languages you have always in the Roman Empire. This is Greek and Roman, Greek and Latin, of course. But you have also, especially in the eastern part of the empire, you still have, the importance of various Aramaic languages that have been spoken, and that are still there. But the point is that with the Roman Empire we have what we call a kind of historiographical tradition that mainly focuses our perspective, and that is, of course, guided by the two leading languages, Greek and Latin. But if we go beyond this, if we have a much more local view, then we also see the local dimensions, the regional dimension, which come to the fore. I just give you an example. So when Saint Augustine, in the beginning of the 5th century AD, we have good evidence that on rural lands in northern Africa, people still spoke Punic. So that's the language of Hannibal. So the political formation ended in the second half of the 2nd century BC, but people still spoke it. But we can see this ongoing local tradition not primarily through the lens of our historiographical tradition, but we have to have a closer look.
I'm going to stop with this, with your permission, and we have just a short time if anybody's interested in purchasing the 2-volume book. Said John just told me of the price. I think here, if anybody's interested, it's how much, Said John? $300. But if you buy it outside, how much is it outside? $420. So it's not a inexpensive book. And you could purchase it cash, and you could have Professor Rollinger sign it, obviously. Or if you have a check, it has to be made to UCI Foundation.
Yes, donation to the center.
And then the memo to the Center for Persian Studies. And with that, I thank you for coming to our one of the first in-person actually meetings. And of course, for the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, we have an entire 3-day conference dedicated to the Achaemenid Empire, one of the lesser empires that have
longer.
and the longest and lesser. Thank you very much. Thank you.